Chapter 15. Nancy's Stratagem. At Mrs. Carrier's outcry, Mr. Drew's face took on a look of alarm. "Nancy," he said, "do you have your magnifying glass with you?" "Yes, I do," she replied, and went for her handbag. Mr. Drew examined the paint which Mrs. Carrier had been scraping with her fingernails. "I need a knife," he said, and Nancy hurried to the kitchen to get one. Her father chipped off more of the paint, then exclaimed, "The face on this portrait is covered with steel nails that are holding down a $1,000 bill." Suddenly Mrs. Carrier said, "I believe they're more than plain steel nails. See how my hand is swelling." The others looked at her in alarm. Bess cried out, "I'll bet there's poison on them." "I believe you're right," said Mr. Drew. "I think I'd better take Mrs. Carrier to a doctor at once." "The hospital is closer," the woman said. She was beginning to scratch herself with her uninjured hand. "I itch all over," she complained. Mr. Drew said that either the paint was poisonous or the steel nails fastened to the portrait had been brushed with poison. "Come, we'll leave right now," he told Mrs. Carrier. "You girls be very careful while I'm gone. I'll return as soon as I can." As Nancy took a sixth portrait from the wall, Bess said worriedly, "Nancy, don't you dare touch that!" The young detective smiled. "I'm certainly not going to touch it with my bare hands," she said. "But I think these scrapings of paint and these steel nails should be analyzed by a chemist. He'll be able to tell what kind of poison they contain." George said she was not afraid to work with Nancy. She procured another knife from the kitchen and also 2 paper bags. Bess sheepishly followed and returned with a knife and a bag. The girls worked for a long time in silence. Each one was very careful not to let the paint touch her skin. The shavings were dropped into the bags. Finally, George spoke up. "How are we going to remove the nails without touching them?" "I saw a tool drawer in the kitchen," Nancy said. "Maybe I can find a pair of pliers." She soon returned with the tool. One by one, Nancy pulled the nails from the picture on which Mrs. Carrier had been working. Most of the black paint had been scraped from the portrait, and the girls could distinguish the face beneath. "Ugh!" Bess exclaimed. "Mrs. Carrier thought all the Banisters were handsome. I guess she forgot this one." George pointed out that the man had very fine features, but admitted he had a stern, cruel expression. Bess commented, "I don't blame Raleigh Banister for not liking him. He gives me the creeps." Nancy laughed. "Well, Bess, you won't have to worry about meeting him. I judge from the man's clothes that he lived a long time ago." "He makes me nervous," Bess insisted. She picked up the portrait and hung it face inward on the wall. Just then there was loud, persistent rapping of the front door knocker. "I guess Dad is back," Nancy remarked, and went into the hall. It occurred to her that this kind of summons did not seem like her father, but rather that of an impatient caller. "I'd better see who's there before I let anyone in." Previously, she had noticed a peephole in the front door. A person inside the house could look out, but no one could peer in. She put one eye to the hole. Standing outside was a huge man. His face was red, and he was pacing back and forth nervously. Not bothering to use the knocker, he banged hard on the door with his fists. "I don't think I should let him in," Nancy told herself, surmising that he could be unfriendly. Perhaps the stranger had been watching the place. After he had seen Mrs. Drew leave, the man might have concluded he could handle the 3 girls alone. There's no telling what he may be up to, Nancy thought. She decided to try strategy. Imitating the recorded voice which had greeted her and Mr. Drew on their first visit, she said loud and clear, "Mr. Banister is not at home. Come back some other time." A couple of seconds later, she repeated the message. Once more, she looked through the peephole. The huge man at the door grew even redder in the face and waved his fist. "Okay," he yelled, "but I'll get him yet. Raleigh Banister can't swindle me and not pay for it." After delivering his threat, the man walked away. Taking long steps, he strode across the bridge angrily and headed for a parked car. Nancy smiled. Her ruse had worked. She returned to the other girls and told them what had happened. Bess said, "I'm glad you didn't let him in. He sounds like trouble. He sure does, George agreed. I wonder who he is. Nancy shrugged. Apparently another one of Raleigh's victims. He was big enough and mad enough to give the swindler a good beating. The girls continued their work of uncovering the portrait faces without their fingers touching the surface. Several pictures had $1,000 bills secreted under the paint. I can't see, said Bess, why anybody would bother to hide money and then put poison on it. He wouldn't be able to use it. Nancy suggested that the bills could be washed. Bess and George commented that this was just one more idiosyncrasy of the man who had built the fantastic house. Finally, the girls became weary of their task and gave up. They had collected sufficient samples for a chemical analysis. The front door knocker sounded again, but less noisily. This time the caller was Mr. Drew. With him was Thomas Banister, who seemed very upset over what had taken place. "This is astounding," he remarked, after greeting the girls. "I can't imagine what ailed my brother. He's a sick man, no doubt about it." Nancy asked how Mrs. Carrier was. Mr. Drew replied, "She'll be all right, but the doctor said that she had come to the hospital just in the nick of time." "How dreadful!" Bess exclaimed. Mr. Drew was told about the paint samples. "Good," he said. "The doctor will want to have those scrapings analyzed. Why don't you girls bring them to him before lunch and see how Mrs. Carrier is feeling?" Nancy agreed and suggested that perhaps they should release the wedge from the bookcase and let it revolve into place. Her father nodded. "And we'll return the books to the shelves." While this was being done, Bess came across a volume entitled Poisonous Plants, Insects, and Snakes. She sat down and began to turn the pages. She hoped that one would be marked, giving a clue to the poison on the portraits. She looked carefully at each page. Finally, near the end of the book, she came across the drawing of a cobra. "Look, everybody!" Bess called out. "Here's a snake exactly like the one in the wall hanging." The others hurried to her side and gazed at the deadly snake. "Here it states," she went on, "that the venom of the cobra can kill a victim within an hour. Do you suppose the poison on the portraits is from a cobra?" "Let's look at that serpent picture in the hall," Nancy suggested. She and the others rushed from the living room and gazed up at the wall hanging, which hung directly above the end of the cut-off crooked banister. Had the searchers stumbled upon a clue? End of chapter 15.